Marshall McLuhan, a well-known academic from the University of Toronto, once said that cult is the root of culture. Hey, thanks for tuning in again to Tarot Tuesdays. My name is Shannon Douglas. Today I'm going to talk about the culture wars and tarot, and what cards specifically apply to an examination of the kind of culture that we live in and the kind of meaning crisis that we're going through. So stay tuned. Okay, so today on Tarot Tuesdays, I'm going to talk about the Hierophant, the number 5 card in the Major Arcana, and how it relates and how we can examine it in a big picture sense in light of the kind of cultural conflicts and challenges that we're having in the world in the present age. I mentioned in my Tarot ABCs and 1, 2, 3s video that the Rider-Waite Tarot was a recreation or a reimagining and redevelopment of tarot that happened in the early 1900s. Came from the Order of Golden Dawn, and there was a milieu around there that I think is the Occult Revival period, we can call it, starting in the 1850s and onwards, with the collapse of the church, with Nietzsche's saying that God is dead, with the emergence of science and rationality and the decline of the church as the central influence in our cultural lives and our social lives. We entered into an age of uncertainty and profound lack of meaning, and this was one of the issues, or the major issue that led to the explorations of different political systems like communism and fascism and various different expressions of ideological or utopian kinds of structures to guide society, because at the time in the meaning crisis, the philosophers were trying to, and magicians, let's say, were trying to figure out the replacement structure to create some kind of coherent meaning in an environment where meaning was disintegrating. Of course, in the early 20th century, we had like the existential philosophers and this crisis of meaninglessness. And there's other people that know a lot more than that, a lot more about that than I do. And I'll kind of leave it to them. So I'm going to talk in larger terms here. So the Hierophant, you can see sometimes in my Italian deck it's called El Papa, sometimes called the Pope or the Priest, and this is the card that refers to the structures of society that we live in, the cultures and the cultural framework and the traditions that we have, regardless of the kind of society that we grow up in. We go through the first along this Fool's journey. So the Fool is the first card that represents you and your path through your growth and development into towards enlightenment and development and understanding. The Major Arcana begins with on this Fool's journey with the Fool card, the 0, and then we go through experience. We come into the physical body and we have the somatic experience. And as little infants, we figure out that, hey, I've got hands, and I've got toes, and I've got a nose, and I've got ears, and I've got this body that I've got to cope with. And then as we grow a little bit older, we develop an understanding that we have emotions and feelings and thoughts, and we start to be able to adopt language and create maps of the environment that we live in psychic space or in subtle space. And then we encounter the archetypes of the feminine and the masculine, mom and dad, right? And the archetypes of the society that we live in with respect to our biological sex and our gender, and the roles and patterns as they exist in the world around us. And then we come into institutional structures. So as we reach a certain age, we get beyond our relationships with mom and dad, and we've got to figure out what the society at large, what those patterns are. Now we have patterns of the Hierophant, or models of tribe and community that date back forever. The simplest forms are small community, tribal. There was an academic from the UK in the 90s named Dunbar, and he came up with this idea of what's called the Dunbar threshold. And the Dunbar threshold is based on the maximum number of relationships that you and I can have as individuals with other people, the maximum number of trust relationships that we can have. in a society. And so human groups kind of naturally grew to a certain size, and then they split, or they would collapse in on themselves, and then they would grow again. And this happened century after century for thousands of years. The human clan or survival group never really exceeded about 150 people in terms of size, but varied between 50 and 150 people. And in that environment, we knew everybody. We could remediate our conflicts and our challenges directly with other people. The community could get together and make decisions together, and everyone was included. Now, I'm borrowing this from conversations and things that I've learned from people like Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Green Hall, very strong figures in the intellectual dark web who talk about these things. And then our society started to grow, and we had to figure out how to solve the problems of the Dunbar coherence, because as our technology grew and as our capacity grew, and as to create food, we moved from hunter-gatherer societies into agrarian, herding, nomadic societies and farming societies. We had to figure out how to get along with each other in larger and larger magnitudes of human civilization. And so we get early stories of Babylon and Assyria and Egypt and the rise of civilizations and subsequent falls. And those rises and falls come with a rise in coherence, our ability to bind and tie culture together and manage culture. And then when those bonds break down, we go through crisis of meaning and sometimes consequential collapse of society because of that change in meaning. So from an existential point of view, or from a meta point of view, a culture is a set of bonds and rules and orders and expectations within society that we all adhere to, often under the umbrella of a symbol. Or a set of symbols. And so those sets of symbols can be ideological symbols. So democracy and freedom and the U.S. Constitution form a kind of Hierophant structure that orients people within the society towards meaning and coherence. The church was a system of coherence. The word religare, the Latin for the word religion, means to bind. So religion was a way of creating a set of symbols that bound society together in a coherent fashion to create stability within society. Another way to bind people is against a common enemy. So for the Cold War and all through the 60s, 70s, 80s, especially when we got into sort of nuclear mutually assured destruction and the nuclear threat and the Russian Cold War, the enemy was Russia, and they were the bad people and we were the good people, and we could have our tribal boundaries around us being good and them being bad, and that created a coherent structure that society could orient itself on and around to create stability within society. So what's happened in the last decade or so, actually really since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of communism and the failure of communism in the Russian state, is that we've, instead of becoming a polarized world where we had an external enemy, an external threat that we could orient ourselves around in terms of meaning, we've now divided ourselves amongst each other. And we have many different cults within the society that we live in, and the gods that we worship are very, very different. This is similar to late in the Roman Empire, before the advent of Christianity, or the adoption of Christianity as the state religion. There are many, many cults and many different tribes with many different belief systems. They were all they were destabilizing the coherence of society, and in order to reorient society, we adopted religion, or an official religion, official umbrella that everyone had to be part of. You were either in or you're out. So the cults and the gods that we worship in the world today, well, one of the major gods that we worship is materialism. The materialists compete in the economy for a position in the dominance hierarchy, which means we compete for more and more stuff and displays of wealth and achievement and externalities that say this is who we are. And there's a cult around meaning in the material world, and a certain percentage of our population is part of that cult. And then we have another cult. We could say that at this point that Trumpists are like cult members. They're believing in an ideology and a largely fabricated fictional world that Donald Trump has created through his propaganda, deliberate propaganda and lies, that people are, and they're existing within a framework or a cult framework that has an us and them positionality within the society that we live in. On the other end of the ideological spectrum, we've got the ideological left, the social justice warriors who are orienting themselves around the concept of social justice and what that means, and defining terms and boundaries of what they believe is acceptable in society, and they've created an us and them tribe around that, or a cult around that we're having to deal with. Then we've got the vestiges of the religious traditions. We've got New Age cults. We've got Eastern cults. We've got self-development cults, and all kinds of different structures that orient us in terms of meaning within society. Under this framework, scientific rationalism is just another cult. Cult doesn't mean you believe in something that doesn't exist. It just means that you're oriented around a certain set of language frameworks that creates or bounds your tribe in terms of its definitions, and by that by defining who you are, it defines what's not you or not your tribe, and that's become part of the coherent structures. Now, reversals in this sense and in this respect. So when people read and examine cards, or when you consider tarot as a set of mnemonic tools, we have an upright orientation, but we also have an inverse orientation in terms of meaning. So what do we think of when we think of the Hierophant and these cult structures in their negative expression? And what's becoming apparent to me in my own thoughts and reflections on the big ideas that I'm taking in from other people is that our meaning structures collapse and become toxic when a certain percentage of the population becomes pathological. We used to orient ourselves around the golden rule. And now, as we become more and more polarized between the right and the left, there's no question that the right wing has its toxicities, and there's no question that the extreme left wing has its toxicities as well. And the inversion of the Hierophant becomes the negative expression of, or the pathological expression of these cults. So cults can become totalitarian, and we see that as having been expressed in Stalinist Russia, in Nazi Germany, in fascist Italy, in purges that have happened all through the 20th century, which are not unique to human beings, by the way, but or to the modern times, human beings in the modern times. But they are expressions of a pathological tribal orientation around meaning, whereby we become so entrenched in our own structures of meaning that the people who don't subscribe or accept those become enemies. And particularly if we get oriented around order, I think particularly that the Hierophant card is an expression of Saturn, which is conscientiousness, orderliness in the big five spectrum of personality. If you remember the Emperor and the Empress, the Emperor is Aries or Mars, or aggression and extroversion, and the Empress is the expression of Venus, which is agreeableness and feminine archetype of close community and relationships in that specific domain. The Hierophant expresses the archetype of Saturn, or the pattern of conscientiousness. And if you're a subscriber to the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson, this conscientiousness, or this Saturn influence in society, those are my words, the Saturn influence, becomes so rigid and orderly and driven by a need to purify the psychic space around this set of ideologies, that they become pathological and even genocidal. And that's a risk, a real risk that we face in the times that we live in. And so the Hierophant reminds us to be cognizant of the kinds of cults that we're surrounded by and the kinds of potentialities that we have. And it also reminds us, you know what? We really could orient our societies around a higher order of meaning. All of us. That's what religion did to help bind the empire. And, the birth of the monotheistic religions and the monotheistic power was not a smooth journey, and it was not without its horrors. If we want to iterate our society, we've got to figure out how to reorient ourselves around a meaning that's universal, that we can all focus on, and that we can all agree to, and that we can all work towards and buy into. Because otherwise, if we're a bunch of fragmented tribes, what's going to end up happening is that, you have these two different characters in the foreground that express the orders and the orientation of the Hierophant in different ways. Got any comments on this? Any highlights from the video? Please be sure to leave a comment below. Like and subscribe. If you want to stay tuned for Tarot Tuesdays, hit the bell and you'll get notifications when I release a new video. I release typically between 3 and 5 p.m. Eastern Time, North America, every Tuesday. And I have a good long map of archetypal explorations in front of me that I'm going to share, and would love to get feedback on future topics.